begin recording, and we'll go ahead and kick off. But I really want to start by saying hi and welcome. My name is Sarah Kettles. I'm founder of Outpass Trekking, and you are here tonight for the finale of our Summer Speaker Series featuring Dante Clemons, who is a stone cold badass and founder of Kick in the Door, which is a career consultancy based in Austin, Texas, serving clients all over the US. And tonight we are going to talk about career advice that you probably haven't received, but maybe you should. And we're going to get all of that from Dante. Before we go ahead and get going, and if you're just joining us, I really want to encourage you to introduce yourselves in the chat. And generally, all tonight, please ask questions, utilize the chat, participate as much as possible. Dante says something interesting, you resonate, maybe you've heard some similar advice, or maybe you've heard something completely different. Pop it into the chat, interact all night long. As with most things in life, you get out what you put in. And if you are going to introduce yourself in chat, add your name, where you're calling in from, and the worst career advice you've ever received. And then enjoy the answers from your fellow participants on the worst career advice they've ever received. I did want to highlight that tonight is the finale of our Summer Speaker Series. You can find more information about that series and the recordings from past entrepreneurs we featured. And of course, Dante's recording will be up later today at outpasstrekking.co. And if you're joining for the first time, you're probably like, what the heck is Outpass Trekking? And luckily for you, I'm uniquely qualified to answer that question. Outpass is a company that provides 4- and 7-day backcountry hiking retreats and some one-day intensives in Austin or while we are out on the road. And the goal of these retreats is really to get back to nature, shed the weight of technology of your everyday life, and get an opportunity to zoom out on the big picture, your vision, and also zoom in and get clear on what those actionable next steps might be. We have a 2021 trip waitlist up now on our website if you are interested in learning more. And finally, I wanted to thank everybody on this call tonight for supporting the Austin Area Urban League. If you've come to a speaker series at all this summer, you know that each speaker is responsible for selecting a nonprofit that they want ticket proceeds to support. And Dante selected the Austin Area Urban League. This figure is actually slightly outdated. There were so many ticket purchases in the last about 24 hours that we topped over $200 raised for the Austin Area Urban League tonight. So I really want to thank you all for your support of that organization. And without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let us all get to know Dante. Dante, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I really, really, really appreciate it. And I just want to acknowledge that this summer has been like totally wild and we're kind of at the end of it. And I want to check in with you and see how your summer has been going for you personally and for business.
Yeah, so thank you for that. I'm excited to be here and excited to see everybody too. This is like one of the first experiences I've had where I've recorded something like this with a live audience. So it's always good to see folks interacting. I think my summer has been pretty chill for the most part. Obviously, being able to kind of work during the pandemic has been a balance, right? But business has been good. It's really good to see people transitioning careers and making upgrades and pivots, you know, even though we're in a recession, so to speak. So that's been awesome. So Kick has been quite busy, and I'm excited about that. A lot of one-on-one calls with folks, helping them negotiate, things like that. So I feel very fulfilled in the work that I've been able to do so far this summer. But at the same time, it's been a lot about like checking in with myself, making sure I'm resting and stuff, because life is really weird right now.
Yeah, it's super weird. Have you, like, was anything that you were planning for your business this summer kind of changed or pivoted with the plans or just with how you've been feeling about things?
Yeah, I think I've had to reflect a little bit more on the type of business that I want to run. I think with the pandemic happening, been feeling more time rich, but also potentially having less energy, if that makes sense. Like I've had to be really thoughtful about what are the things that get me the 80% of the results that I need, right? But it only requires like, maybe it's the 20% of focus, right? About all the things that I could do. So I really had to make those strategic decisions around what are the things that I want to double down on, right? That'll get me the impact that I want. But that also helps me to conserve energy, because again, this is just, I have to always say that, because I think we, even as adults, like get into this habit where we're working through a thing without really acknowledging like how weird it is, and to have those regular like habits and rituals disturbed, right, or disrupted. If your regular ritual was connecting with friends on Fridays after work, and now you can't really do that in the same way, like really just acknowledging that and being adaptive to that. And so in my business a bit, I've had to pivot like where I gave my energy to. I was sending out weekly newsletters for a time, right? And decided that, okay, that wasn't driving the actual ROI that, I was looking for. So now I do monthly, but I do more Instagram lives. I do more calls. I have more time now for having one-on-one calls with people, because that's driving the impact that I find to be really fulfilling and helpful. So just that really, like, I think constant awareness and also reassessment of what's the best ROI for my time and my energy. Because right now, again, life is weird.
Yeah. I have to imagine that I know I resonate with this, and several people on this call resonate with feeling time rich during a pandemic, but also feeling strangely drained, even though we have less to do seemingly. And I thought it was interesting that you brought up rituals and how maybe your rituals have changed. Are there rituals that you've kept? And do you have any new rituals that you've introduced that you're like, this is a keeper?
Yeah, I think before the pandemic, I think earlier this year, I had a moment where I was like, I need to rest harder. And I didn't know exactly what that meant. Like, for those of you who know me, I bathe like generally every night. Like, bath time is like my time. Like, it's where I listen to podcasts. Sometimes there's wine involved, sometimes not. But it's definitely a place where I put no time boundaries on bath time. There are days that are so stressful for me. The water gets cold, I let it out, I run more water. Like, it's like my place where I can kind of ease into the evening and ultimately rest, right? And so at the top of this year, I was like, that time is not quite enough, And so what I found with myself is that I get energized from conversations with people that are either doing cool things or just cool people, right? And so I started doing probably twice a week coffee meetings in the mornings. And so between the hours of 8 and 9, I would meet somebody, generally a friend or a friend of a friend, for coffee close to work, something like that. And so I had all these coffee meetings that I was like in a ritual of. And that was restorative. It was also inspiring, sometimes encouraging, right? Because you never know what conversations go. Mm-hmm. And so with the pandemic, obviously, that got disrupted quite a bit. And March was hard. Like, March was the month it all hit, right? And a month where we were now, working from home. And so my patterns were so disrupted. Like, there were moments where I was waking up 10 minutes before the first meeting of the day. There were moments where I wasn't sleeping very well at night because feeling kind of time rich, but also like, what is life right now? Like, I kind of got teleported back to college, where it was just like, you're in this environment, but it's a blur. Like, you have deadlines and stuff that you need to do to be responsible. Cool, get that done. But after that, like, there was just no more, I guess, stability really that I was feeling. So March was weird for me. But after that, I definitely kept the bathing, don't get me wrong. But after that, I really started to think about, what could I add? And so I started slowly like having porch hangs with people. And so the coffee morning times that I would have pre-pandemic became porch hangs. And so I started having folks over sometimes on Thursday or Friday or even Saturdays or Sunday mornings for coffee, right? We would sit on my porch with my Beyonce fan and just kind of catch up. And so that helped. And so I think I'm always in this questioning phase of like, how am I feeling? What more can I do? And definitely, though, I allow myself to rest a lot. Like, there are days where it's just like, this is it. That's all we're getting, and that's kind of cool too in entrepreneurship, because you get to make that call as well. But I allow that more. And I think previously, before the pandemic, it was definitely like, oh, you got to hustle. This is what you do. This is like how it goes, whereas now it's like, I'm surviving. That's enough. I'm going to rest today.
I love that grace that you give yourself, and it seems like you've gotten more comfortable giving yourself grace as the pandemic has dragged on too. And you tapped a little bit into some of the struggles that you experienced, especially early on in March, April timeframe. But I'm curious if you could talk us through a career challenge you've experienced this year, a challenge in your business that you've experienced this year.
Yeah, I think career challenges are ongoing, right? If you're growing, I think, sometimes it's about self-advocacy, right? And going for a promotion. Other times it's about, speaking up if you feel like, you're missing an opportunity or there's an opportunity for you to have a different assignment, right? Sometimes there's reorgs and now you have a new manager and you have to kind of state your case of like, hey, this is the work that I've been doing. This is what I want you to know about who I am. I feel like career challenges are ongoing. And I think for me this year, it's been about aligning and having better expectations set with my manager. I think being in a remote environment can add challenge to that because our regular visibility is disrupted. And so there's more reliance on managing up and however that looks. And so I've not been inclined naturally to manage up very well. I'm the person that like you give a mandate to, and I'm out of sight, out of mind. Like generally I'm just off like getting it done.
Mm-hmm.
And working remotely, I've had to learn how to adjust so that visibility was more of a part of my day to day. And not like the fake visibility where you're like the green light on Slack is on and like, yeah, I'm working, but you're like off somewhere, but really like strategically updates. Hey, this is what happened this week. This is the biggest decision I'm kind of working through right now. This is something that I anticipate is going to be a blocker. Do you have any opinions on that? Like just really having more of the richer conversations that are in effect updates, but ultimately help me manage the perception of the value that I'm driving. And so that's something I've had to learn. I've had to work toward that. So that's been definitely a career challenge and something that to me is ongoing.
Those are really helpful examples about how you manage up. Tell me a little bit about that process of building that self-awareness of, I'm not naturally somebody to manage up in this way. And then also, how did you figure out that those were the strategies that were going to work for you and for your manager?
Yeah, I mean, in hindsight, it all kind of connects, right? And it makes sense. And I'm able to like fluidly talk about it in situations like this, but in real life, it doesn't feel that way. In real life, it's like, oh, like, you are upset because you didn't get information you needed. Oh, this is painful for me. How do I help you get better at it? And I think sometimes too, specifically because of the pandemic, this is new for so many of us. So my manager in many cases may not even know what they need, right? Until you hit a moment where it's like, ouch, this doesn't feel good. How do I navigate this? How do I now take this information that I now have and make sure that I'm giving you what you need to be successful? So I think it's a cycle of communication. And for me, I consider many things to be an experiment. You know, I think as long as I'm not doing the exact same thing, again, knowing that thing didn't work previously, I'm okay with myself, you know, but I just acknowledge that too and try my best to give other people grace, because your manager may not always be able to tell you exactly what they're going to need 3 weeks from now, 6 months from now, until you stumble upon a thing and realize there's a gap. I'm like, okay, all right, I think I'm learning this lesson, so I'm going to try this. Is that cool? And just literally have those check-ins. And so most of the times those lessons are painful. I just think that's kind of part of the process.
I hear that. I love your approach to experimentation though, because I feel like it removes some of the personal feelings that we can get tied up into when you're just like trying something new. And then you can kind of look at the data. Does this work? Does it not work for what it is? And I'm curious if you can tell us about an experiment that went well and how you celebrated that win. Like, how do you celebrate wins in your business or career?
Yeah, so I think I share them really, honestly. Like, and I think, you know, when we talked about how do I identify what to experiment with, oftentimes I do have feelings about it. I am in my feelings about it. Like I generally create like 1 or 2 confidential relationships at work where I'm like, this thing happened, I'm spazzing, or I'm feeling this way about it. What do you think? And hopefully that person has some context because they're also in the company, right? They can probably know the key players in that environment. And so they can give me perspective. And so those are the same people I turn to when something goes well. And it's like, you know, man, I crushed today. This just happened. Or, oh my gosh, this person just gave me a high five for X, Y, and Z. So I think I celebrate by sharing with my community, because I don't think it's something that we're always encouraged to do, but I don't see how we can be successful without having that circle of confidants, right? Because I think it's easy to just get burrowed in your own experience without coming up for air to consider how it might be impacting your manager, or what stress your manager might be under, or what factors might be driving a change in their behavior that you just had no visibility into. And so some of you on this call, I've probably called you crying one day. Like sometimes it happens that way. But so I think the challenges are ongoing, but when you find something that works, I definitely try to celebrate with my people.
Yeah. Laura actually has a really great question in the chat. She's wondering how all of this transfers to your entrepreneurial work. And I'm actually really curious, like you talked about really leaning into your community at work. And I do want to acknowledge that in addition to running Kick in the Door, you also have a full-time job, which is pretty freaking cool. But how do you celebrate those wins, and who's in your community when you're off running Kick in the Door by yourself?
Yeah, so entrepreneurship is kind of hard, right? Like there's no real playbook for it. And the most of what you get and the most of the content that's out there is just people sharing their experience, right? And so your experience can be distinct, and my experience has been distinct. So I try not to compare my experiences with other people's experience. But I think one of the things that has been really freeing for me is just having agency around, again, this concept of like, what kind of business do I want to run?
Mm-hmm.
But I hit blocks in business all the time where I'm like, this makes me uncomfortable. Like, I was challenged to do Instagram Live for 14 days and I cried about that. Like, it's just something that I just never really wanted to do. But when you think about the people that you can reach or the people that you can impact, that becomes the driver towards, doing the things that can make you uncomfortable. I think one other thing that has made me, I think more productive in my business is also just being really clear about where I need outside help. And so when we talk about community, that's part of it, of like, hey, like this aspect of the business stresses me out. Like I've been able to kind of divorce my identity as a business lady from my inability to do this one thing that I really just don't enjoy doing, right? So I can outsource that. And like having the freedom to do that, it's like, okay, just because you own a truck driving company doesn't mean you have to be the person driving all the trucks. Like you can hire somebody to do that and you can manage the books and the partnerships and so on. And so I've just kind of been able to identify those parts that are less fun for me and then outsource those. And oftentimes those conversations start in community. It's like, hey, Sarah, I'm having trouble with this component of my business. Does that resonate with you as well? How do you manage that in your business? And from there, sometimes recommendations come out of who I can talk to actually outsource the thing. So that's how I rely on community in my business.
I love that. You're kind of poking in on something that I think is really interesting. I'm wondering how you relate it back to, like, say somebody comes to you, a kick in the door, and they're like, I'm really afraid of this thing that I've been tasked with at work. And how do you specifically know the difference between something that you're afraid of and that you need to tackle to get over that fear versus something that you're not necessarily afraid of? You're just like, I don't want to do this and I need to outsource it. Like, where is that line for you? And how do you coach somebody around that in your business?
Yeah, I think for me, the awareness comes from just having a strength about my skills. And also, like, if something's not fun, particularly in entrepreneurship, I often ask the question, why am I doing it? And because we get told, even in work, like, right, we get told like, oh, it's work, it's work, it's work. Like, you just have to kind of suffer through it. And I don't believe that. Like, suffering causes wrinkles. I'm not interested in that. So it's a question of, okay, if you don't like this thing, how can you iterate your career to pivot to more of what it is you do like? Like, those roles exist. Like, you can get the 80% that you love in a role, but it's by having that experience where you're like, I tried that. I don't love that. I tried managing people. That's not really my jam. Or I tried B2B environments. I don't love that. I tried nonprofits. Not my jam either. Like, you can literally iterate your way to what I think is a more ideal career. And obviously there's always some levels of challenge that come up that you have to manage through. That's kind of what is about, like life is about, but I don't think you have to suffer through anything. And so I think when it comes to my business and the parts about it that just in the pit of my stomach just feel like anxiety, I go to my community and I'm like, hey, this is how I'm feeling. And oftentimes what can transform that from anxiety to like inspiration, if you will, or encouragement, or something that allows me to reframe how I'm thinking about it, is by talking to somebody who's already done it, and then who can point out for me my gaps. Sometimes it's a gap in my thinking. Sometimes it's a gap in a belief of my abilities, right? Which entrepreneurship, I think, is just constantly that. Like, you're always going to be doing this new thing that requires a new you or a new aspect of yourself, And so it's always a question, do I want to do this? I'm scared of this. This makes me nervous. Or is this just a part of the process? Are the nerves that I'm feeling a part of what it feels like to be an entrepreneur? I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago about driving change in organizations, right? And like how discomforting that can feel. And it's like, well, this is what it feels like to be the change, Like, nobody talks about what it feels like. You just see cute people on Instagram, with the hashtag boss lady, kind of thing. You think it feels glamorous all the time, but it doesn't. Sometimes you have to do QuickBooks, and that's not always fun.
Yeah. I love that. I have to imagine that kick in the door came out of a desire to move your career in a direction towards more things that you love and want to do. Tell us a little bit about the inspiration for starting Kick.
Yeah, so Kick was started when I lived in New York. I'm from New Orleans originally, wanted to be an architect my whole life, since I was about 8 years old, went to undergrad for architecture, practiced architecture, didn't enjoy architecture. And then, coming up for air and being like, okay, this looks like the path to a miserable life for me. I don't want this. Like, how do I figure this out? And I didn't have a mentor. I had loving parents and loving aunts and loving uncles. But they were from a generation where they had one job their whole life and like didn't have a familiarity with what it felt like to really job hunt or go through interviews or even pivot careers, right? So I didn't feel like I had a lot of resources. And I was 25 at the time. I moved to New York, and I moved to New York kind of on a whim, if you will. Like, I talked to a friend of mine about it, and she was on some Sex in the City stuff, like, oh, you should move to New York. And I was like, nah, that's not really on my game plan at all. Like, I wasn't thinking about that. But I knew I wanted to go to grad school. Like, that was the one thing where I was like, I can go to grad school for business. I minored in business in undergrad. Like, that seems like a good path for me. And on one call, she was like, oh, you should come to New York. It's fabulous. It's this and it's that. And I was like, whatever, girl, I'll move to New York. So that's how I made the decision to move to New York. And once I made that decision, though, I started looking at grad schools in New York and found one that was akin to an MBA before designers. And it didn't require the GRE, and the applications were due in 2 weeks. So I applied to grad school, interviewed on a weekend. I flew up there alone for a weekend, interviewed, and got in on the spot. And so I moved to New York to study business at this art school, Pratt Institute, where I met Julie. And I just started doing all kinds of creative stuff while I was there. But ultimately, when I got to graduation 2 years later, I was struggling a little bit with identity. I didn't know like how to present myself. I now had these business skills, but I was an architect. And I was thinking I would go into real estate because, you know, architecture and business just kind of made sense, like real estate development, cool. But as I was applying to those types of jobs, they were like, nah, you're a designer. We're not going to call you. We're going to go call the kids from the real estate school at Columbia. So it's like I wasn't making any progress in the real estate sector. I could only get a unpaid internship, right? And so I had a friend of mine that worked at an ad agency, and she was like, hey, I can get you onto this ad agency. Why don't you come here? Because I had done some digital stuff while I was in grad school. So I wound up working at this ad agency, but I was making $50,000 in an entry-level position at an ad agency after grad school in one of the most expensive cities in the world. So economically, upside down, didn't make sense. But that was the opportunity I could get. And while I was at that ad agency, I hustled and I got promoted within 9 months, primarily because I was overqualified. But it was always this constant seeking of like, I know my peers are making $85,000, $90,000. I'm making $50,000. How do I close this gap? Like, I have to pay Pratt back for this education. How do I close this gap? So I was in this like real like pressure cooker, if you will, of professional development, just like trying to figure this out. And I was kind of lame at the time, but I spent one snowy weekend in my apartment just trying to figure out who I was now that I was in digital and successful in digital, but still had these skills of an architect that I had learned and started to transfer over to digital. And I, at the time, you know, was trying to interview at different places, I was getting interviews, but wasn't getting offers. And so I realized like, I wasn't selling myself well. Like, I still didn't know how to talk about my skills in a way that was convincing to other people. So I wasn't getting offers. And I knew that. I could tell that. I could sense that. And so I was in my apartment one weekend, just like, let me pick apart my story. Like, who am I? Why do I do what I do? What am I good at? Like, all these things. And so I started to craft my narrative at that time, V1 of it. And I updated LinkedIn with it. And one of the things that I looked for at that time was, all right, my mile marker for a great job is Google. Google is like the epitome of tech. This was like 2014, 2013, something like that. And Google was like my guiding light at that point. And so I was like, I'm going to write this as if I were writing to Google. And so I looked at their tone and how they wrote about the work that they did, because Google was a behemoth even then, but they were also very humble in their writing. And so I mimicked that, put that on LinkedIn. I'm still at the ad agency. A couple months go by and a lady from Google DMs me on LinkedIn. And she's like, hey, I have this job rec opening. Would you like to interview for it? And GChat was popping back then. And so I just messaged a couple of friends on GChat, my community, and was like, oh my God, this just happened. Like, this is wild. And so I realized that my story was starting to resonate in a way that was working. And I wound up not working at Google. I did have a couple meetings with her, but she reached out to me directly. So HR wasn't involved, which means the process was like convoluted, and her schedule would change. She would like push me out another week or whatever. But I wound up taking a job at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And then the process of like discovering who I was and what my strengths were and how the skills that I built and developed as an architect actually transferred over to digital and how to best communicate that, I started helping friends do the same thing. I think when that Google signal went off, it just kind of activated me and also activated my network to be like, help me with this. And so I helped my friends. And so they started to get results, and then they would refer me to their friends, and then their friends started to get results. And I got paid from their friends, which is also kind of cool. And that's legit how the work started. And then somewhere in there, I don't really remember, but there was a commitment to, I'm going to do this and like make this a business. I think once the money started coming in. And I was in New York at the time, like I said, and I was listening to the song that my brother kind of told me about, this Jay-Z song that he loved. And I kept playing the song over and over, trying to figure out what my brother loved about the song, because I didn't really love the song when I first heard it. And Jay-Z had this line where he's like, leave the door open, hoping they kick it down. And I was like, that's it, kicking the door. And it's like, so I wasn't even thinking about like the Biggie song immediately, but it was really like that organic way of thinking about intention, right? And like, what is the energy of this really about? And it's really like, your career, to me, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like from a life quality standpoint, like your career is the foundation of that. It's like, if you can get that right and get paid at a salary that is both fair for your skills, but also allows you to live the life you want to live, like everything you build on top of that just gets tremendously improved, right? Yeah. And so folks, though, just it's hard to figure out. And so many times we look to our parents or to the people we know that are a little older, and they may not have the answers too. And I find that, you know, the only source that I had at that time was like Forbes.com, and it was always some white dude in a suit telling me what I can do. And I'm like, I don't believe you, bro. Like, I don't think that applies to me. So Kick was really to solve that gap. And so in the work that I do now, I work with all types of people of all types of backgrounds. I've had transgender clients, right, who are just literally coming to me like, I need to find a place where I can show up as myself, and it's not a problem. Like, that's a beautiful use case, but like, you don't really see that so much represented in the career guidance space, right? The guys on Forbes aren't talking about that. So Kick, I think, exists to plug that gap, but also it's just no fluff, you know, it's just like real straightforward. It's guidance you can actually use, and the aim is for everything that we produce to be actionable. So yeah, that's my long-winded story as to how Kick became a thing.
I love that. And I love that the focus is on things being actionable. And you spoke a little bit about this when you described why your transgender clients have come to you for support. But I'm curious, like, what are some themes? What do people generally come to Kick in the door to get help with?
Yeah, so sometimes it's funny because people tend to think, hey, I need resume help. Mm-hmm. And you're like, okay. And then when you start talking to them, it's beyond the resume. It's more about, again, like who they are and what value they add. So I think the resume thing is how I often hear the problem stated, but when I start talking to them deeper, it's a question around, you know, how to best position themselves for the thing that they want. Or sometimes it's people that just are like, hey, I kind of want to do this, but I don't know how. Mm-hmm. You know, I want to switch careers. This is my best approach to do that. And it literally includes starting from the bottom. And they're like, and I'm like, no, like, you're already credentialed. Let's position you this way. So I work with sometimes too, like people that have trouble, like advocating for themselves. So I've had, and this has been white men, white women, definitely I see it in populations of color, right? Of just like, or immigrants even too, especially of like, you know, this is the best, this is what they gave me, this is what I'm going to go with. First, it's like, no, like, let's have a conversation around a negotiation. Let's have a conversation around the offer. Like, it's only the first step. Like, there's more that, you know, you can discuss in terms of compensation here. So I think it's really allowing people to advocate for themselves, but giving them a framework to do that. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes reframing the negative connotation that's associated with negotiation, which I think is kind of an American thing. And it's amazing because I'm like, no, you can ask for that. You can ask for that. We can say this, you know, this is how we might say that. And they like take notes on it. And usually when clients are in a negotiation situation, I'm on standby via text, right? And so they're on a call or they're doing a thing. And then I get the text and I'm like, okay, you can say this. And then they say, then they're like, oh my God, it worked. You know, it's just kind of this mind-blowing response of like, oh, wow, like this wasn't a negative thing. Like me negotiating wasn't a terrible thing. And I kind of rely on my own experience with that. I had a negotiation event with the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which is a nonprofit, well-funded at that time, but I negotiated hard with them. And I don't know what they were trying to pay me, but it was New York. And I'm like, bro, I gotta pay rent. I can't. Mm-hmm. And so I negotiated really hard with them. And I'm not gonna say hard, but just fairly. Like I negotiated fairly. Yeah. When I actually got the job and walked in on my first day and was kind of getting a tour, the guy who was my manager was like, good job on the negotiation. I want you to negotiate our contracts with our vendors. And I was like, Okay. So
Wow.
I've had like positive feedback to showing up in a way that, we've been told might be negative, but ultimately, it was a positive thing to show up and negotiate. So
Yeah.
I get a lot of that with Kick, a lot of that.
It sounds like you've kind of discovered, or I imagine you've discovered over time, some truths about negotiating, about getting what you want out of your career, about any aspect of this. And I think you hit on one that's really interesting, where you're like, it's almost like you're giving people permission to think about things in a different way, think about things in an alternate way than what society has told them to think about it. Can you share some other truths with us that you've discovered over talking with your clients over time?
Yeah, you can always like create a situation where you win. Like, I don't care if it's a recession, I don't care if there's a contraction in whatever industry, like folks are still looking for people with good skills who are reliable and who are competent, right? And as long as like that's the story, that story is crisp, like you can win. Like, so that's something that I believe to be true. The other thing is, if you have experience, and I say this a little loosely because I think if you're coming straight out of undergrad, it's a little different, but that's tends to not be my target for that reason. But if you have experience, 9 times out of 10, you have something that you can leverage for your next career pivot. I think oftentimes we think about switching industries like, oh, I need to go back to grad school. And it's like, no, you don't. Maybe you need to take three of these classes. Maybe you need to understand the nomenclature that people use. Maybe you need to understand how finance might work in that particular industry, but you may not necessarily need a whole degree to switch careers if you've already gotten 8 years of experience doing something else. Like, a lot of skills transfer. So I think one truth that I believe that if I could tattoo it on my Kick sweatshirt, I would. It would just be like, skills transfer. Like, you don't have to start over. There's ways in which, a floor plan for a building is not that different from a wireframe for a website. Nobody told me that, till I'm in it. And I'm like, I'm good at this because I learned this already, And so I think for Kick, I think that's another truth. And the other thing is, you don't lose by asking for more. Like, I would rather a world where you ask for more when you're in a negotiation phase up front than to get into a role and then you're worried about money, or you find out Bobby that sits across from you is making 15 grand more because Bobby asked for 15 grand more. And I think I've lived through that, right? And so that's the kind of thing that drives me. But that is also a truth that I believe in. You don't lose by asking for more.
Yeah. I think you've touched on, some limiting beliefs that people have that maybe you help them overcome over the course of bettering their career or negotiating that next salary. And I'm curious if there are any limiting beliefs that you've discovered that you've had and have got over in your career.
Yeah, for me, it's managing up always. Like, that is like my Achilles heel, because I think sometimes when you are, when you are entrepreneurial, sometimes, for me at least, the symptom that comes of that sometimes is impatience.
Mm.
And early in my career, I'd be like, this organization sucks, I'm out of here. You know what I mean? Like, I would hop a job like it was nothing. My mentor was like, oh, you quitting another one, huh? And I'd be like, yeah, I haven't found it yet, And so and that was always my instinct. My instinct was to move on, right? And again, when you're competent and like you can actually produce a thing or two, like, it's not hard to get a job. At least that's what I believe, and that's also what I share with people with Kick. That's not the hard part. The hard part is making sure once you're in it, you're good. Like, you're good enough. Like, you feel like you have what you need to be successful. You like the people, you get paid enough, things like that. And so I was challenged actually by my therapist. She was like, let's see what happens when you sit a while. And I'm like, I don't want to sit, And so I learned honestly that it's actually a trauma response to run all the time. And so oftentimes when you find yourself in an organization where things may not be moving in the way that you want, sometimes it's a series of conversations that are worth having to see how you can unlock that and change that. And that's been my personal, I think, kind of professional development journey. It's like, okay, I can quit. True, I can do that. Like, but what else could I do? Could I have a conversation with this person? Could I put together a plan and share that? Could I help them understand, how this is impacting me and others like me? Like, can I basically have more patience with it and patience enough to invest, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's been my journey a bit, of kind of leaning into that. And that's been a surprising experience too. Like one where I'm learning other skills, right? Like, yeah, I can always quit, cool. But, I can also invest a little bit more and sometimes even be surprised by the outcome of that.
Yeah. I really love the way you described it as helping your clients feel like they've gotten to a place where they feel good. Like their salary is where they need it to be. They've sold their narrative. They have the skills they need to be successful. They're confident about it. But I actually want to take us back to maybe 15 minutes ago. You brought up a transgender client that's come to you, and the real unique need there to feel good in the sense that this place is going to be supportive of me and who I am. And I'm just really curious, like, how do you guide somebody who has those very unique concerns through the process of finding something that's going to work for them in that
Yeah,
way?
I think the overlap is identifying like what kind of work they want to do first, right? And really it comes down to culture. And I think because there's trying to see if I can best explain this, because I'm thinking about how to productize this too so that people can make these decisions on their own. I haven't figured that out yet. But at the core of it, and I studied organizational development too. I taught it at Pratt. So I know this stuff kind of intuitively, but also, from, if you will, like a McKinsey or HBR point of view too, of like, startups have a different type of culture than an organization that has 300,000 people,
Mm-hmm.
right? And an organization that has 300,000 people, a very mature organization, a very large organization, oftentimes global organization, probably has infrastructure in place, really mature processes around HR, really mature processes around benefits, really mature processes around ERG groups, right? And you finding your tribe within that group and so on.
Yeah.
Startups per se may not have that, but what they might have is a more clearer like diversity stance, or they might have, three co-founders that if you were to meet them in an interview, you might feel safe in that environment, right? So I think it's around identifying what kind of organization is best for you in terms of your ability to thrive and get your needs met, but
Mm-hmm.
also at the same time aligning with an organization that values who you are and what you bring. And so for a transgender client who had a very unique experience, not only in his gender transformation, but also in his country of origin, the kind of work that he was doing was kind of in the nonprofit sector. So we were able to work together, identify a couple of organizations that seemed to have the values that would be resonant for him, but also did the type of work that he found valuable. And after that, it's really just an interview process of like how you feel when you interact with folks and how they respond to you. Because when people are uncomfortable or not based on like how you present. And that's a little bit of the process, if you will, in a very kind of shorthand version. But it's a balance between the work you want to do, but also the cultural values that the organization seems to have, and
Yeah.
then validating that in an interview process.
And I love the emphasis on the culture the organization seems to have. And I want to be honest that there are a lot of white people on this call. And Dante, I'm curious what advice do you have for white people who are passionate about making their workplace a place that is comfortable for the LGBT community, for people of color? How can we take a culture that seems like it works and demonstrate that it does?
Yeah, and I think it honestly, like simply put, like it just comes down to kindness and fairness and slowing down enough when decisions are made to really think about how it impacts other people.
Mm-hmm.
And so, we were talking casually earlier today, right, about, oh, we could play this game where it's like everybody shows like their baby pictures. Cool. But if I'm the only brown baby, everybody knows who I am. So it's like having awareness just in subtle things like that could make somebody feel othered, right? And I think more specifically with organizations, it comes down to a lot of processes that we have, whether it's perks that we have or team outings, even things that might make other people uncomfortable. And just being thoughtful around specifically like when you have somebody on the team that's Muslim, right? Or might have a different religious kind of orientation, thinking about like what habits and rituals that they might have that we could be more accommodating of. It really comes down to empathy. And I think you can only be empathetic when you're informed. And so oftentimes that comes from just having a better cultural awareness, right, for folks, but also when you get to know people, just really listening for, what their preferences are and what their needs might be. And I think some of us have more social capital in organizations than others. And so we made a move to say, okay, I want to make sure this group of people feel very comfortable. We might be able to drive more change for that group of people than somebody else that doesn't have that same social capital. So I think it's also self-awareness of like, how much influence do I have in my role? You know, I'm a product person. Product is generally given the microphone in any meeting we're in, you know, so it's like, how can I be thoughtful in those cases to maybe advocate for another group that doesn't get that same visibility? So I think we all have that. I think we all have to kind of tap into that, be aware of it.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Thank you. We're coming up to time, but I have to be selfish and ask you two final questions because I've been thinking and I don't think I can narrow them down. So I'm curious, Dante, looking back at the career you've built so far, the businesses that you've built so far, what's something that you wish you would have known when you were first starting to explore your entrepreneurial dreams?
I think it's okay to not be the expert at everything. Like, you don't have to be the expert at everything. I was talking to a friend of mine who's a copywriter who's launching her copywriting business. And it's like, the things that make you anxious, write them down and you can outsource them. Like, that is literally okay. You're not cheating at entrepreneurship if you outsource stuff. Like, there are experts for a reason. I'm not amazing at selling people in a traditional sales way. Like, I can help you solve a problem and maybe that's my sales method, but like, I'm not great at email marketing, like getting you into a funnel and whatnot. So like, I'm outsourcing that. And so I think that's okay. It doesn't make you any less of a business person because you just don't have interest in doing a particular thing, or it stresses you out, or you have the opportunity to learn it. And when you hire an expert, you have the opportunity to learn it from an expert. So I think that's one thing I wish I'd have known earlier on. I probably would have procrastinated much less had I given myself that permission.
Yeah. Honestly, I need to take that advice for myself, I think. Thank you, Dante.
It's resonant, man. It works, I tell you.
It does. Yeah. I'm going to try it. I will. I'll report back. One final question for you tonight. This has been phenomenal. Thank you so much for sharing your stories, your perspective, your advice. What goal are you chasing next? What can this group be watching for from Dante Clemons?
Oh my gosh, that's a huge question. I want to be a full entrepreneur, like full, like I when I think about the work that I do, and even obviously working remotely now, I feel like I have a lot of agency over how my day is constructed, right? And whether the morning ritual to the evening ritual, you know, and what happens, you know, in that 5 to 10 p.m. window after work, right? I love that. And so I want to get to a world where, you know, ultimately I do have this mix of things that I'm interested in, but I kind of govern my whole day based on that mix. And to me, that's kind of the freedom that I see associated with being a full-time business owner.
Mm-hmm.
But in the next couple months, I want to mature, kick a bit. I want to automate some things, make the experiences much more consistent for people, and also want to get to a point where folks can interact with me without interacting with me directly.
Wow.
So thinking about ways to scale it. And I think one of the hacks that I have to think about that is just like, plan for massive success. Because when you plan for success, oftentimes that means creating systems that can work without you, if you will. So I plan to mature kick a bit, so there'll be more visibility of what's happening on that end. And also I'm working on something else that should be launching by the end of this month, maybe early October, which you guys will probably see and hear about local in the Austin area. So really excited about that. I think my whole game is just to like chase the problems that I'm curious about solving and put energy toward and see what sticks.
That's awesome.
An experiment.
I love that. Y'all, that concludes our program for this evening. If you are interested to borrow some of Dante's language in investing and planning for your own success, you can connect with Kick in the Door on Instagram at Kick in the Door, email squad@kickinthedoor.com, or just straight up head to the website, www.kickinthedoor.com. Dante, anything to add here?
No, that's it. Reach out, y'all.
Thank you so much for attending tonight, for closing out our speaker series. Dante, you are phenomenal. Thank you for your perspective and stories again. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, y'all. It's good to see everybody.
Yay.